The third branch we're going to look at is the judicial branch, and if I had to pick a favorite, I guess this is the one that I would like the most. I think the constitutional law part is very interesting in the Supreme Court, and one of the reasons why I have you guys working on those amendment projects, I think it's pretty cool. The learning target here is I can explain the structure of the U.S. Supreme or U.S. court system, not just the Supreme Court, but the U.S. court system, including the Supreme Court. And the constitutional powers of the judicial branch outlines the kinds of cases to be decided by the judicial branch. Article 3 gives the federal courts jurisdiction over two types of cases, and those involving constitution or federal laws or disputes with foreign governments. And the second are civil cases in which the plaintiff and defendant are states or are citizens of different states. And so you have federal and civil crimes and constitutional that you're looking at. And just a note that judicial review, that the federal courts must be to declare all acts contrary to the Constitution void. And so that was kind of a mouthful, but judicial review is just looking at was the Constitution followed, and if not, then if that person was put in prison for the wrong reason or something, or we didn't follow their rights, if we then they could be let free or given a new trial. So that's called judicial review. And there's actually more of a picture of that judicial review that we're looking at there. So the checks and balances, they can declare treaties and executive acts unconstitutional. That's what the judicial branch can do. And the appointments are for life. So that means that they're for life, meaning that they don't have to be elected. So they don't have to vote a certain way to get your vote. And it's supposed to leave them a little bit more non-biased. And then the judicial checks on the legislative branch is that they can declare some laws unconstitutional. Some federal cases begin the original jurisdiction over most of the federal cases is the U.S. District Court, and they look at interstate and international commerce, disputes involving federal taxes, and patent copyright issues, issues involving treaties, disputes involving citizens of other countries, bankruptcies, disputes between states, generally involving federal law or the Constitution. So that's what the U.S. District Courts are looking at. So they're not looking at your petty crimes or your local state things. They're looking more at the federal level. The appeals court is when you think that one of your rights may have been violated, you might end up going to an appeals court. And so this is a mid-level court, and only a fraction of cases decided in district court actually are reviewed by the appeals court. And of these, even smaller number get all the way to the Supreme Court. So you have the U.S. District Court, that's the lowest one, and then you can move up to the appeals court. And the appeals court says the judge who staffs the appeals court sits in panels of 3 to hear cases. Their primary job is to review district court cases to determine whether a district judge made an error in applying the law in that trial. So they're looking to see if that person got a fair trial or not, or if some law was broken, or if their constitutional rights were not followed. And the Supreme Court can overturn decisions made in the appellate court. So even if an appeals court makes a judgment or a ruling, it could go all the way to the Supreme Court as well. And there's just a list of the different courts, U.S. district courts here, that you can see how many are in each area. And federal judges, nomination terms and salary. Again, we talked about this in the executive branch, but the president has the power to appoint federal judges, and judges serve for life or until they choose to retire. So you can kind of, if you've seen any of the current Supreme Court justices, you probably would think one or two of them might ought to retire here soon. And they can only be removed through impeachment, and then salaries cannot be reduced during their tenure. And again, that's because that keeps it so that they become more non-biased, and they're not salaried can't be diminished because of some way they vote or something. And on the Supreme Court, there are 9 justices, and the Chief Justice is John Roberts. And justices are appointed by the President and approved by the Senate. They also serve lifelong terms. The court is asked to review several thousand cases each year, but will only hear about 100 to 150. And so overwhelmingly the cases reaching the Supreme Court are appeals from the cases that began in those lower courts I talked about. To be able to put on the calendar, to be able to have your case heard, 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices must agree to hear the case, and then that's added to the court's docket or their calendar. The role of the Supreme Court is a major role. They are to interpret the Constitution, and so most of their decisions either uphold or overturn a decision made in the lower court. And if the Supreme Court overturns the lower court's decision, it may send the case back to the lower court for further action. For example, should the court decide that a criminal defendant was denied a fair trial, the case might be sent back to the lower court to either be dismissed or they could be tried again. When the justices vote, they have a majority opinion, dissenting opinion, or concurring opinion. And again, you're starting to look at this with some of your amendment cases that you're looking at. And the majority opinion states the reason for the court, whether they think the Constitution was upheld or whether it was violated. And so they it might be 6-3 or 5-4 or 7-2, whatever it might be. That would be the majority. And then the people that have the smaller number is the dissenting opinion. So it might be 3 people or something. And then they would just write their dissenting opinion. Okay, we disagree with the majority opinion because, and then they list their reasons for that. And then a concurring opinion are justices who sided with the majority but for different reasons. So different reasons than the majority opinion. So they might write a concurring opinion. In it, they explain how the reasoning differs from the majorities. And because few decisions are unanimous, these additional opinions often accompany a majority opinion. So those are 3 things to look at when analyzing a case. The last slide here is on judicial activism versus judicial restraint. And earlier we talked about judicial review, where it gave the Supreme Court the ability to look at cases and determine whether they're constitutional or not. And so this kind of gives judges the role of interpreting the Constitution. And there's judicial activism, and that's based on the belief that the court has the right and the obligation to overturn bad precedents and promote socially desirable goals. Now, liberals tend to be engaged in judicial activism a bit more than conservatives, and they look to the court to defend the rights of women and minorities when legislatures fail to act. Now, conservatives tend to more agree with judicial restraint, and that's when judicial review should be used sparingly, especially in dealing with controversial issues like abortion rights or gay marriage. And their view would be that these justices or judges are not voted in by us as citizens. Instead, they are appointed. And so they shouldn't be the ones that are kind of creating our laws or telling us what should happen. On the other hand, again, if there's something that's happening in society that's becoming more socially acceptable, sometimes the laws do have to change to reflect that. So it's kind of this balance between judicial activism and judicial restraint. And this is what Chief Justice John Roberts has to say about it. He says, judges are like umpires. Umpires don't make the rules, they apply them. The role of an umpire and a judge is critical and make sure everybody plays by the rules. But it is a limited role. Nobody ever went to a ball game to see the umpire. That's probably a true statement. All right, that ends our unit on the 3 branches. Again, you can go back and review any of the lectures. Make sure you take the quizzes and get those all in before the test. Have a good one.